It looks
Are you able to
like
see? Are you able to see? Okay, perfect. So I'm Nick, as introduced, and we work broadly on media integrity at Google. So any case where media is being used to deceive, we also specialize in information quality, which is becoming a bigger and a bigger field over time, sort of including more and more things. Um, and just, Sonia, if you can give me a thumbs up, can you see the slides? Okay, perfect. I can't see what everyone else is seeing, unfortunately. Um, so you've probably all seen and discussed things like these articles. Ever since their sort of introduction, the term deepfake was coined in, I think, late 2017, early 2018 on Reddit, of all places, in a since deleted post. Deepfakes have been a really kind of salient feature of the news landscape. People are very concerned. There's lots of kind of predictions and wondering, is this the end of truth, so on and so forth. And deepfakes can be photorealistic. The fears are not unfounded, but we still on our team wanted to know this really intense interest. Does this reflect reality? So if you look at misinformation in the real world, is it all deepfakes or is it multiple things? Like what's being used to spread misinformation narratives and stuff like that? So we started Amoeba, which is the external name for our project, kind of carrying on the long tradition of terrible portmanteaus for computer science work. But it's effectively this project to do a large-scale survey of misinformation in the wild. Because we wanted to see what kinds of things are happening online in the real world, as it were. And to do this, it's actually much harder than you would think. So we used fact checks as kind of telescopes to observe misinformation claims. And we had humans annotate those fact checks and kind of describe what sort of misinformation they were seeing, what was going on in the fact check, what misinformation claim was being fact checked, so on and so forth. The data collection took 2 years. We collected hundreds of thousands of annotations, hundreds of thousands of misinformation claims, tens of thousands of items of media. And we kind of tried to package all this into a coherent narrative and make it a paper. And we're really pleased that it's now finally published on the archive. And we also published the data set on Kaggle. You are welcome to go through this long and fairly dense paper on your own, but I'm going to try to go through a couple of the key findings that I hope will be informative, and I hope won't be too redundant with what you've heard already from the paper. The first one was that misinformation relies heavily on the use of media. This probably isn't a shock to you. We were aware of this ourselves. However, we were taken aback by just how many misinformation claims depend on media in a significant way. What you're seeing here is kind of a plot. So within a given window of time, what fraction of the misinformation claims measured depended materially on a piece of media. And by depended materially, we mean like if you didn't have the media, the misinformation claim either wouldn't exist, it wouldn't make sense, or its effectiveness would be strongly diminished. So as you can see in the past couple of years, upwards of 80% of all misinformation claims have depended on media, which is astonishing to us. I mean, we knew it would be high, but we didn't think it would be this super majority. And that trend appears to be, with some dips that we might talk about later, appears to be kind of increasing over time. And as far as the most common modality, so what kinds of media are being used, historically it was images, and then starting a couple years ago, video actually became more common. So what's funny is, throughout history, for all of the period that we had data, and throughout part of the monitoring process, because you can see that the green line is when we started data collection. In the blue, you see misinformation-based images. So these were images that were used for misinformation claims. And we started measuring and we were like, we can only pick one kind of modality to focus on. Let's do images because they're the most common. And as soon as we made that decision, effectively, the proportion of video began to creep up, and it's continued to creep up. And now it's actually dominant. It dominates over images and all other kinds of modality. In terms of why we think this occurs, we can't really say directly. It could be shifts in how fact checkers prioritize things to fact check. It could also be shifts in platform preferences. We're all aware of the rise of short form media, which now is a very dominant type of data consumption. So that might also play a part in this. When I tell people what I work on, the first thing that they always ask is about generative AI. How much of it is deepfakes? How much of it is generative AI? What's going on there? And the answer is that it, by and large, it just wasn't present. So if you think of this another historical graph as kind of like a fossil record, as a species, generative AI just didn't exist. It didn't show up in the fossil record for a long, long, long time. So if you recall, 2018 is when the term was coined. Mid 2018, early 2019 was the kind of peak of interest during this first initial hump, but it wasn't reflected in the misinformation record until late 2022, early 2023, which is when we saw this abrupt spike in misinformation that uses generative AI. And it correlates really well with this. You probably have seen this image. It's the Pope puffy jacket image. I think that that was actually a mechanism because a lot of people realized how realistic generative AI can be. And so did fact checkers, so did members of the press, because many people had the experience of seeing this image, being unaware that it was synthetic, and then learning after the fact that it's actually generative AI and being really surprised. So it kind of was a sort of a wake-up call, if you will. We can compare it to other kinds of media manipulation that are common. This is Photoshop in blue, and then images of doctored text in orange. But I should say that the y-axis of this graph it's not all misinformation associated images. It's actually just images that are content manipulated. So the pixels have been changed in some way to adjust what the image appears to depict. And keep that in mind for later. I think regardless, though, we can say that the more apocalyptic predictions have yet to materialize, sort of, knock on wood to make sure that stays the case. So you might ask, what has been happening then? What's this AI generated content being used for online? And I can't answer definitively, but I can share some observations. You've probably all seen this image as well. This image is part of a suite of images that are all kind of the same thing that came out earlier this year. They went viral. They're called Shrimp Jesuses. And just interesting tidbit, Shrimp Jesus went viral almost a year to the day after the Pope jacket went viral. So I don't know if next spring we'll also have some kind of weird viral image. But collectively, the term that's kind of emerged to describe this class of AI-generated content is AI slop. It's kitschy, it's melodramatic, very often it's really surreal and kind of weird, but it generates really significant engagement. And it's subject to fact checks, so it shows up in our misinformation fossil record, if you will. The degree to which people believe that this content is real is a complex issue that we'll discuss more in a bit. And also the degree to which it deceives people, does it cause people to update their model of the world, what's going on there, is also kind of open to debate. So as an example of one that could possibly be deceptive, this is from Meta's widely viewed content report. This is the 15th most viewed piece of media on Facebook, I think. In quarter one of 2024, it is a synthetic image. It got 28 million views. And it's really fascinating to me because if you look at it, it has this fake quote at the beginning. I mean, as near as we can tell, Kylie Kelsey never said these words. So they had an invented quote. They had a Gen AI image. They also had an inset image, which is also Gen AI. And then they have a quote unquote attention arrow that you might have seen in like video thumbnails pointing to their hands, which is particularly ironic because the hands are really badly made in this particular image. So it kind of flags it as Gen AI in some sense. But regardless, the purpose of this image doesn't appear to be to deceive. the function appears to be to direct traffic to a content farm, which is linked in the pinned comment. And that's certainly a substantial fraction of all the GenAI slop that we're seeing, is it's kind of directing people to other places. And it's this event never occurred, this photo was never taken, but the degree to which it's deceptive, again, is up for debate. And if you pursue this kind of stuff, you can kind of go down a bit of a rabbit hole, as I've done on many occasions. Here's another example of a really widely viewed piece of content. It's a plant of some kind, apparently, but it's fake. It's not real. It's a synthetic image, and it is based on a real plant. Certainly, this plant, Geopersia rosapicta, which is a common houseplant. You can see a real version here, and here's this fake version, which is like an extremal version of the real one, right? It's just more extreme, it's more colorful, it's more dynamic than the real thing. And I think that this author said it exactly right, that it's surreal AI generated content. But what is the purpose of this? I mean, partially, sure, to drive engagement and views, and it's sort of like a whole genre. Is these fake AI generated images of plants? They're really common. I also, as a side note, get asked pretty often about how to tell if something is Gen AI. There is no silver bullet, of course, but in this image, for example, one great way to do it is to look for inconsistencies. For example, if you look at the path, you can see it follows sort of this direction if you're above the plant, but then there's a bit of path here that seems to go off in a different direction in sort of a weird way, which is a really good signal that what you're looking at is Gen AI. Additionally, in Gen AI content, the foreground and the background can interact in weird ways. Like here, for instance, you're seeing this rock appear to follow the contour of the leaf in front of it, which is obviously not the case in real life. This happens all the time and in tons of different ways in Gen AI content. So just keep an eye out for that if you're curious about spotting Gen AI stuff. Anyway, so back to this deluge of synthetic plants. If you look at the sort of creator, the garden crafter, also a Gen AI image, and then their logo also appears to be Gen AI. It in fact contains a misspell of their own name as Garden Crafton, which is strange. I think someone commented about directing things to seed stores. That was very prescient, and we will come back to that in a second. You might think, I mean, as I thought, no, I mean, they're clearly saying, I don't sell plants. Do not buy from suspicious comments, things like that, which I thought was fairly surprising. So it's possible that they are indeed just driving, they're just an engagement farm, basically. But if you take, for example, this post, which is from their account, they identify it as bonsai desert roses, and you search for it, you will come across websites that are selling allegedly these plants. And I love this image because it's $31 or $32, right? And the flavor image is this enormous centuries old apparent bonsai that's clearly fake, and it doesn't exist at all. But it's again uncanny because this plant you can make into people really do make bonsai out of them. If you have 40 years, you can grow something that looks like this, but it will probably never look like this ever in 100 million years. And if you buy that product, what you get is this, these little tiny stubs. So it's a very uncanny, like aspirational, beyond real kind of thing, this sort of driving marketing attention, I guess. And it's weird. And in some cases, of course, like this one, I saw this one yesterday. This is absolutely not real. There's no plant in the world that has cats for flowers. It doesn't exist and it can't exist. But they're still trying to sell plants that allegedly do this over time. So the role of Gen AI slop does appear in part to be to deceive people, but not to deceive people in a misinformation sense, which I always kind of I use the term misinformation very loosely, but it's not causing people to believe incorrect things about the world beyond the fact that if they buy this product, they'll get back a cat or a plant that grows cats. So there's sort of a couple different categories that we've seen. We have these really salient images, we have clickbait. A lot of them have easy calls to action, like type amen, that sort of thing, which is all of these are kind of a certain kind of engagement farming. Then we have marketing. A lot of the marketing appears to be aspirational versions of what the product could be. Like no one can definitively say that you'll never get a bonsai that looks like that, but almost certainly you won't. Sometimes it's outright impossible. And then there's also a bit of a scarier version, which is things that they're Gen AI. This image is from Hurricane Helene most recently. And the stated opinion of people who post it is that it doesn't matter if it's real or not because it represents something they perceive to be true, something they perceive to be the case. And because it's articulating what they know is true, it doesn't matter that it never actually happened. They can treat it as evidence of some kind of concealed truth anyway. So it's not necessarily apocalyptic Gen AI yet, but it is being used for a variety of purposes that kind of scale in terms of nefariousness. All right, so we all remember this graph. This is the frequency of Gen AI over time. And remember I said this was plotted against the proportion of all misinfo images that have some kind of manipulation going. But manipulated images are actually fairly rare. I know it's the canonical thing we all think of when we think of media misinformation. It's like Photoshops or Gen AI, but they're actually fairly rare. So if we plot Gen AI as a fraction of all misinfo images, we see it's actually a fairly small proportion. And here is content manipulation. So this is everything like Photoshops. This is Gen AI. This is anytime you edit the text, anytime you crop something deceptively. It's still only about 20%. So what's the remainder of the misinformation images? Like what accounts for them? And the answer is context manipulations. They were, and they probably still are today, the dominant type of misinformation that uses media of any kind. That's obviously our next key result, that while people talk a lot about Gen AI and Photoshop, context manipulations are the dominant form. You may ask, what are context manipulations? Well, they're quite simple. Context manipulation occurs when you take a real piece of media, like oftentimes a real unmodified image, and then you lie about what it depicts. You might lie about where it was taken, who was captured in it, the circumstances of its acquisition, when it was taken, those sorts of things. They can all be context manipulations, and they're used to kind of bolster a narrative. And it's not restricted to any kind of misinformation, any specific narrative. It's hugely variable. Literally anything can be made into a context manipulation, essentially. And within context manipulations, we also classified whether or not the claim was separate or embedded in the image. And actually, images like these, which we call self-miscontextualizing because they contain the image and they contain their own caption that misleads, are the dominant form. And these are really, they're particularly insidious because they're really shareable. They don't rely on someone recreating the false context and they share it on a different platform. You can just take the image and hit post. And they're additionally, pretty problematic because context manipulations, they don't have any of the forensic traces that you might exploit to detect a Photoshop or to detect a Gen AI image. They're completely authentic images. I mean, obviously this one with the CGI people in the pods isn't, but oftentimes they are, and they don't leave behind any forensic traces. So in order to dispute them, you have to be able to find an original, which takes extra work. And you might think that because they're so simple, they must be really easy. They must not be effective, but all of our evidence suggests that they are really effective. So despite their simplicity, they appear to do a very good job of spreading the misinfo narratives that they set out to spread. And they can get really complex. Here we have an example where you have the text interacting with a pair of images in kind of a complex way. So people often talk about, oh, well, we can get a computer to look at the claim being made and then kind of contrast it with the real circumstances. It's not always super obvious what the claim is. Oftentimes it's implicit. It may rely on your knowledge of the current misinformation narrative that you're engaged in. They might not be used to recruit people into a false belief, but rather to encourage people to keep going from within one. They can get very kind of fine-grained and complex. Misinformation is super polymorphic. You probably already knew this. You probably knew that misinformation can take a ton of different forms. We knew it going into this. We thought we're going to make a taxonomy that will include every possible type of misinformation. Surely there will be no kind of misinformation that doesn't fit neatly into one of these categories. And probably within the first 20 minutes, we discovered things that didn't fit neatly into those categories, as you expect. So you actually had to add categories as we were collecting these data because new phenomena kept popping up. One of them, one of my favorites actually, from an academic perspective, is take a look at this image. This is kind of a wild image because if we tried to reconstruct its origin, as near as we can tell, someone created this poster that you can see in the center, and it's about, I think, taxes and climate change. But they photographed it, or possibly made it into a video, and then posted it on TikTok, which was then captured as a screenshot and then posted on Twitter. And then someone saw that tweet and they actually physically filmed their MacBook Air with their phone and then posted it to Instagram Reels, where it was screenshotted again and then posted to Meta Threads. So it has a super long kind of origin story, this really long edit graph. And each time this happens, you're adding elements to it that kind of accreting onto the image. And we call this sedimentation because it works kind of like sedimentation in geology. And you might think that it is, it's a bug. It's an unavoidable consequence, but it might be that this is actually kind of a feature where a lot of misinformation that we observed in Galileo, or in Amoeba rather, it was part of a collective sense-making effort. So this collaborative thing to kind of describe what was going on in the world according to their false beliefs. And the presence of all these little tiny artifacts, of all these things accreting that demonstrate the participation of other people in investigation, might actually encourage them to be shared. They might actually add authenticity. And I just think that's totally kind of mind-blowing that this is something that's actually might be a positive for shareability. An additional kind of neat thing is we saw this part a lot, the filmed part, where people appear to be pretty unaware of their computer's screenshot function, and they tend to share things by taking photographs of digital displays. We actually had this as a separate category because it was so common. You can see, I mean, it's not super common. It's like 1 to 2% of overall misinformation images. But the reason we broke it out is because the people who are doing this are unintentionally making these images much harder to debunk. Because if you have a Photoshop, if you have a GenAI image, like I said, there's sometimes traces, forensic traces that you can pinpoint in the image. But those rely on very low-level statistical features of the image, which are effectively destroyed when you're displaying it on a television or on a phone, and you're taking a separate photograph of it. So it makes the process much harder. It makes provenance recovery much harder because you're basically inducing this transformation on the original image or video that is kind of hard to control for. So it's something that matters very much to us who are forensic practitioners who use forensic tooling. And as far as we can tell, it's totally unintentional, but it's an extraordinarily effective way to make our job harder. Another category we saw all the time, in particular during COVID, was manipulated news chyrons. So a chyron is that thing at the bottom of a news broadcast, that like scrolling text thing. And people would take screenshots of real news broadcasts, and then they would just add the fake chyron at the bottom. So they're kind of borrowing the authenticity of the news to spread something that's completely not true at all and has the wrong date, the wrong subject, the wrong everything. But people see it, and because it has the news logo and it looks like a news broadcast, they go, "Oh wow, that's crazy! That was a real news broadcast," and they believe it. The perhaps the most insidious category that we noted during the study is what we called a false official document. This also was very prevalent during COVID, and this occurs whenever someone takes a totally fake message and they add features to it like letterhead, like logos, like font and color choices that make it appear like it's an official communication or an official document from the government, from a news organization, from another kind of organization, or from any kind of official reputable source. It's actually quite common and appears to be becoming more common over time. This is like a 5% of all misinformation images have this form where they appear to be some kind of communication from an official entity, an official government body, something like that. And they're really harmful in cases when you need to get misinformation out quickly, like a crisis. You don't want people to be using fake versions of official announcements to give people the wrong idea about the correct action. But nonetheless, because their commonality suggests that they're actually quite effective. And yeah, I think that the most common use case, they're unintentionally. I don't think that people create these in some cases with the purpose of making people act incorrectly. A lot of them were like during COVID, for instance, it would be original versions of announcements that had like the conspiracy being true, like, oh, don't wear masks, they'll hurt you. And then they're like, this is the CDC's guidance, so they secretly changed it yesterday. So they have a variety of different motivations, but they're ubiquitous during times of crisis. Another question that I get quite a bit is about trends. So I just spoke about things becoming more common during COVID. And in general, the trends are kind of hard to distinguish. They're really hard to kind of establish in our data for a couple of different reasons. And I'll sort of give you an example. So this is a bunch of different categories that we measured. And I've graphed them over a couple of years. And I've plotted in these sort of red vertical bars. These are major events that happened during COVID. And looking at this, you probably can't be like, oh, well, yeah, I can pick out all the trends immediately and I can see all the effects and whatnot. It's really hard. When you have a lot of possible events and a lot of possible categories you can kind of associate with those events, it's really easy to come up with spurious correlations. Here's another example. This is the modality of misinformation, again with COVID events. And it sure looks like some of these red lines, these red vertical lines, appear to be producing changes in the data distribution. You might be inclined to say, oh, wow, that's, the first COVID case reported in Hubei province really is driving the move from images to video for a while. But in general, these things are almost certainly spurious. They are just your pattern finding brain trying to find patterns in what's effectively noise. Instead, what appears to be driving trends in the kinds of media people are using to produce and spread misinfo is things like the availability of technology, the ease of certain kinds of approaches to make manipulations, and then whatever platforms happen to be popular online at the time, because people tend to be motivated by getting the greatest amount of reach possible. So if the modality of the popular platforms are changing, then the modality of the misinformation will change as well. But really, that's pretty much the only thing we can claim about what's driving these kinds of global trends in misinformation. So that's pretty much it. Just to recap, misinformation relies heavily on media, much more than we expected, and we expected it to be a lot. While generative AI is the subject of widespread concern, it was really absent from the misinformation load until late 2022, when it exploded in frequency, although it's still not a dominant form of misinformation yet. We did wrap up data collection in November 2023, so it's possible in the intervening year it's increased even more. But much more common then, and probably still more common now, and in my opinion, more insidious, are context manipulations. They are easier to create and harder to detect, but appear to be very effective nonetheless. And finally, the landscape of misinformation is changing rapidly and it's changing all the time. It's really hard to predict where it will go. And it's really tempting to say that certain kinds of events will be the first AI misinformation event. But in practice, very, very hard to predict where it will go. And it's driven mostly by the kind of broader information ecosystem. Great, thank you so much. I've linked the paper in the dataset. If I'm able to share these slides with you at some point, please take a look. Yeah, happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much.